I'm Mina Malik Hussain, and this is The Coffee Table, and today we are having a vital conversation about the political empowerment of women in Pakistan. And it is such a relevant and eternally important conversation to have. The statistics are not always very promising, but what is promising is that the amount of work and dedication that so many women are putting in Parliament, in the Senate, on the ground with civil society, and working really hard to change things and to keep that change going. And I'm so excited today to be talking to two wonderful women who have spent decades working for political representation and being seen and women's voices. And I'm delighted to be welcoming on the show today Nighat Siddique, who is an additional Director General heading the gender wing at the Election Commission of Pakistan. She has served as the DG of Gender Equality at the Women's Development Department in Punjab, back when it used to be a ministry, which is very important. She is also, amongst her many, many hats that she wears, she is a regional trainer on peace and conflict resolution and has been a gender advisor with the UNDP, with UNICEF and United Nations Women. We are also joined on the show by Ms. Rashda Dohad, who is the Executive Director of the Umar Asghar Khan Foundation. She has over 20 years of experience in democratic governance and public policy, and her areas of expertise include disaster response, civic activism, gender sensitization, and sustainable development. Hello and welcome to the show, Wonder Women. Now, Nighat, I want to begin with you, and I also want to kind of put you in a spot because I've been looking at statistics which the ECP has released, and in 2020, data from 2020 shows that out of 115 million registered voters in Pakistan, 51 million are women, and out of the parliamentarians that are currently, running the show, only 20% are women right now, and female ministers make up 10% of all our ministers, and we have about 17% reserved seats for women. So these are the sort of general statistics that we are looking at. But don't you think that 51 million women is not quite enough women registered to vote? Why is that important?
It's very important. It's a base actually for any sort of political engagement or political participation, that we have more and more women as voters, because to have more women as voters means that the voice is heard, that the voice is part of the democracy that we have.
Yes.
And having more women as voters would mean equal representation. Because the more we have women, the more representatives we'll have.
Yes.
And the numbers that you just gave of low women representation is because there are more men as voters.
Yes.
And even when we have this number of women, it's around number of women as voters, more often than not, the voter turnout for women is pretty low. So there are quite a few areas that we need to work on, and we are on it. But then slowly and gradually we'll reach where we want to.
Absolutely. So what do you think the main factors that go into that low turnout for women when election day comes around?
Mena, we need to understand the dynamics that we have, that women face here.
Yes.
There's quite a few challenges that we have.
Quite right.
There are cultural, socio-economic challenges. Women, there's dearth of access to information for women.
Yes.
But things are improving.
Yes.
We should look at the brighter side, that the numbers are improving. Since 2020 electoral roll, that is voters list that we had, it's the first time, and it's pretty unprecedented that we have numbers increasing. Like from October 2020 to June 2021, we have come up with around 3.3 million new registered voters.
Excellent.
And out of them, there are 140,000 more women than men registered, which is pretty unprecedented.
Excellent.
Yeah.
That is wonderful. So what do you think is happening here? Do you think that women, do you think it's becoming like a good kind of snowball effect where women have more access to information and women are sort of becoming more politically active? Do you think that it's also because, let's say, NADA has been really good about getting women's identification cards set up? Because, you know, obviously you need that to vote. So what do you think is happening here? What is causing this increase?
Well, we need to understand that it's time for change, and change is setting in. Looking at the government's policy, talking about election commission, I would say that we've started with a reaching out policy to the communities. Instead of waiting for women to come out of their houses and get registered, we are reaching out to them.
Yes.
Election Commission started a campaign in 2017 in 103 districts with more than 10% gender gap on the electoral roll. And from there, the story starts, because it's the fourth phase now, which is about to be launched, but we have been able to manage and enroll around 10 million women from 2017 to 21, and that's a big number.
Fantastic. That is excellent.
The way was, the approach was that we would reach out to women, not only sensitizing them about importance of NIC and voter registration, or including their voice in the democratic process.
Yes.
But we also went out to the male member of the household, sensitizing them about the importance of women's, participation and representation. That did a wonderful job. That's how the change started, because Men Alliance is very important.
Yes.
So we took men as allies, educated them, gave them this information, sensitized them, and that's how we had more and more women coming out, getting their NICs registered and the vote registered thereon.
Yeah, that's excellent. And it's also a two-pronged benefit, because once you have your NIC in place, not only can you vote, but you can also open a bank account. You can, you become a documented member of society. You can get a COVID vaccine with your NIC in place. And that's really, really, I think, a really important document for all citizens of any country to have. And now that we're talking about civil society, I think, Rashta, this is where you come in. Hello and welcome to the show. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Excellent.
Thank you. And thank you for having me, Mina.
I'm really excited to be having this conversation. So, Rashta, tell me a little bit about how the Omar Asghar Khan Foundation, which has been around since 1999 and has been doing all these wonderful things. I know that one big part of the mission or the values that the foundation has is finding ways to communicate a sense of political responsibility and a sense of participation in civil society. So can you tell me a little bit about the work that the foundation does in that regard?
Sure. And, for us, women's political participation is a very important element.
Yes.
And the way we go about it is, when people are organized, especially when women are organized, you can see the collective power of women.
Right.
And I think that's one role that we play a lot in organizing women in villages, in towns. And when they come together, they are able to influence decision making, they are able to better influence. Now, clearly, I think your starting point is a very important one, that we are not where we want to be.
No.
But if you look at where we are today in comparison for where we were, say, 10 years ago or 20 years ago, I think we have come a long way. Now, as you were saying, what are the elements that explain the change?
Yes.
So one thing, clearly the data shows that there is much more improvement in women's education, in their access to health, in even workforce. I remember when I started working almost 30 years ago, we would sit around a table in a meeting and I would be the only woman there. But it's not like that anymore. So, things have changed. We have a long way to go, but we are moving in the right direction. So when you have better education, when you have women in the workforce, when you have women organized, when you have women understanding their rights, their obligations as citizens, you always find that they participate more readily. I also want to say that one important element has been local government.
Yes.
So, since 2002, we have had very progressive local governments in Pakistan. To 2013, when we had all the 4 provinces decide local government. So when you have local government, you have a lot of women who are also able to, become representatives. And once they become representatives, they come into the mainstream, you find that then they easily come up if you look at a lot of women, and in fact even men who are today members of the National Assembly,
Yes.
or the Provincial Assembly, or even the Senate, and you trace their roots, you will find some level of local government experience. So I think the fact that having local government creates a lot of opportunities for women, both as voters as well as public representatives.
I think I'm also curious about, Rashda, is something that Nighat also mentioned, that when we have more women participating in political decision making, then we also have more, it basically becomes like a sort of, the more women are out there, the more women follow as well. So I think, is it true then, do you see that happening, that if we have more and more women in local government, and we have more women in parliament, and we have more women in the Senate, then that they are sort of clearing the path for other women to follow suit? Because are there still hesitations that women have when it comes to participating in politics?
Well, I'm not going to be in any kind of a denial to say, of course, there are many, many challenges.
Yes.
But yes, definitely, when you have women role models, whether they are politicians or, people, anchors like yourself, a lot of people watch television, they see, absolutely, they see, there's so many women anchors. They see people like Nighat, who's in a very senior position in the Election Commission, and plays a role model place. And within civil society, we have a lot of organizations that are headed by women. We go out working in very, very male-dominated societies. We work in many conservative areas. And when they see us out there, then we get a lot of this feedback to say, well, you can do it, so can we. So I think, yes, role modeling is a very important, sort of incentive. It encourages people, and it encourages a different worldview for both women and men.
Absolutely. Yes, Nighat.
I would say that it's not only women representatives as role models. It's very important to have more and more representatives there, because they are the voice of the voiceless.
Yes,
they would be representing those who cannot reach there.
Yes.
And the issues that we have at the grassroots level, especially of the communities who do not have an access to all this, I think that would be justified if we have more and more women sitting on the decision-making tables, especially at the policy-making level.
Absolutely.
Then the issues of the communities would be addressed better.
Absolutely.
And I wouldn't even talk about, not only women. I would also say it should be women with disabilities, or person with disabilities, and transgender minorities. We should have all these segments at the decision-making table, and their issues should be embedded or addressed in the policies.
Absolutely. I'm sad that you brought that up. We're going to take a very quick break at this juncture, but we're going to come back and talk exactly about women and minorities in policymaking. Exciting conversations ahead. Stay with us. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to the coffee table, where we are having a vital conversation about women's political empowerment in Pakistan with Nighat Siddique, who is an additional Director General heading the Gender Wing at the Election Commission of Pakistan, and Rashda Dohad, who is the Executive Director of the Umar Asghar Khan Foundation. Now, before the break, Nighat, you made a really, really, really important point about how we need to have more women, more minorities, more people with disabilities, more trans representation. So basically, we need to have as diverse a body of change makers and policy makers on board in order to put into place policies and then laws that will protect and help as many segments of society as possible. So where do we stand right now let's say when it comes to women? Because I do know that statistically, women lawmakers and women in governments usually tend to focus on things like health and education and inclusive lawmaking, which ultimately benefits society generally. And I think that that's something that's really important to consider.
Thank you. It's a very important question and a point of discussion. I would say that there are quite a few pro-women or gender-sensitive legislation that we have in place now, only that we need to have strict implementation of it. Talking about elections and electoral participation or maybe political participation of women, I would say that Electoral Act 2017, on which we had Gender Election 2018, which is the latest act that we have here in place, is pretty gender-sensitive. That is, it addresses all these segments of the society that you just mentioned. We have Section 9 of the Elections Act, which says that if there's less than 10% women voter turnout, the election will be declared null and void. And the Election Commission has the power to declare it null and void, which is a big step, I would say, in bringing women to the polling stations and getting them to increase the voter turnout.
Yes.
Then we have Section 47 and 48 of the Elections Act, which are talking about special measures to be taken by not only Election Commission but all government departments, including NADRA, for ensuring increased enrollment of women voters, and that increased enrollment of persons with disability, transgender, and minorities. So it does address all the segments of the society. Then we have Section 93, which talks about disaggregated data. We have Section 91, which talks about postal ballot facility for the first time provided to persons with disabilities. This was earlier only with the government servants. But now it's given an offer to person with disability that they could cast their vote sitting home. We also have Section 170, which is which penalizes anyone who tries to bar women from voting or stops women from participating in electoral processes.
What's the penalty?
Yes. And penalty is imprisonment as well as fine.
Excellent. So it's like a searing. It's not just a slap on the wrist, but this is an actual, there are consequences. If anybody tries to stop you from going to cast your vote as a woman, they can get into serious trouble. I think that's a very important thing to know.
And then we have Section 206, which is talking about, which is making it compulsory for political parties to give 5% representation to women on general seats. And this is other than the seats that they have as on quota,
Right.
So I think this much for Electoral Act and this much for Gender Sensitive Act. We also have Harassment Act in place, and it's very seriously implemented at Election Commission. We have Asset Crime Prevention Act. If I start talking about the legislation, there's a long list.
Yes, but one thing I'm also curious about, because I know that when we talk about legislation, we have so many progressive, intelligent-sounding, detailed, sort of things in place, like layman speak. But Rajda, again, you work on the ground, you work with people, you work with civil society. There is clearly a gap here between the sort of good intentions of the government, which has all this legislature in place, but then things that happen on the ground, which are different. Like, for example, this penalty that if you prevent a woman from voting, you can be imprisoned and have to pay a fine. But I've never heard of anybody getting into trouble for doing that, for example. So what are the challenges here in this gap that we need to be looking at?
The Election Act 2017 is a landmark act, as Nigat has mentioned, because in the 2018 election, we did see that, for example, the election in Shangla went into a re-election. It was declared null and void because there was less than 10% vote for women. Now, what that means is that no candidate wants to spend so much money on elections. So to make sure that the 10% is reached, candidates go out canvassing for women's votes so that they don't go on to runoff election as it happened in Changla. So I think that these sort of legal sort of instruments are extremely important, and the Election Commission should be commended for using their authority that we did see in the 2018 election. Now, just to show what a difference it makes, we have had in the 2013 election, for example, cases where not a single woman voted in Dir because there was what you call a general agreement between parties that women would not vote. Now, under the election 2017 law, that is just not possible. That cannot happen now. So I think, yes, often there is a difference, there's a gap between legislation and implementation, but this particular law is very, very significant. And we have seen in the 2018 election that it has also made a difference because it forced the Shangla election to be redone.
And I think that very succinctly and neatly illustrates the argument also that, when we say 10% minimum representation for women or 10% votes need to be cast by women, it doesn't sound like a lot, like 10% out of 100, like the other 90% votes are still coming from men. But then when you look at something like the situation in Dir, like you just mentioned, 10% is still much more than zero. And we do have areas in the country where that number is zero, or used to be, where women had completely like no representation whatsoever in the democratic process. But now we do, at least that. I think that's also often, when we're looking at statistics for Pakistan, this often happens, is that on its own it doesn't sound like much, but when you look at it on the ground and what's actually happening, it's actually quite important and quite remarkable in that way. And that also then sort of leads me to another thing that I'm curious about, and maybe Nigat, you can tell me a little bit about this, is that when we, for example, look again at the statistics, and we are looking at, women parliamentarians, about 20.2% of the entire parliament. So that doesn't sound like that many women, but from all accounts, even that amount of women are effective agents of change, and they're working really hard to bring about significant change, even though there's sort of number-wise, there's not that many of them.
I would say that it's not the numbers that we should be worried about. It's the quality of work that's taking place there.
Yes.
The kind of legislation that's being tabled and enacted. And the issues that are raised, because having a big number of women there, like if we talk about CEDAW, which is Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, this article says we need to take temporary special measures. Under temporary special measures, we went in for quota.
Right.
But the quota, if we're talking about the quota, which is reserved seats for women, let's say in National Assembly, we have 60 of them. And if we look at their legislation or look at their legislative business, we need to see what's happening there instead of having more than 60 and still, not very effective legislations or issues addressed at that level. Wouldn't be a good idea. So how the policies are addressing it, how the legislation is addressing the issues, and then once the legislation is there, how is it implemented? We don't need big numbers to implement that. In fact, once we're done with the representatives in the parliament, we trickle it down to the ministries and to our departments. We need to see the number of women there, and we also need to see if we have conducive environment there for women, so that these legislations could be enacted.
Yes.
And to talk about election commission, I would say that the way I earlier said, the change is setting in.
Yes.
At Election Commission, we are very, very cognizant of the fact that we need to provide conducive environment to women. We need to increase their numbers. Here we talk about, we work on 4 tiers, that is women at Election Commission, and how we can provide them, like we have a daycare center for women.
Yes.
We provide them during COVID-19, they were allowed to work from home.
Yes.
And then we talk about women voters, how we could provide them accessibility by reaching out to them. We then talk about women polling staff.
Yes.
How do we provide them conducive environment at the polling stations? How do we encourage more and more women to come out to increase the voter turnout?
Yeah.
Last but not the least is the women representatives.
Yes.
And for them also, we keep working on building up their capacity. Again, at the end, I would say it's not the numbers, it's the quality and not the quantity that we're looking at.
Yeah.
So I think we need to improve the quality also.
Yes. And Rashda, you were saying something really, really interesting about the Women's Parliamentary Caucus. So I want you to tell me a little bit about that as well.
And Meena, if you allow me, I want to just add something to what Nighat has said. It is absolutely true. I think these numbers have to be seen within the context of our a very patriarchal society.
Yes.
So for women to come up and overcome all the challenges that they face is remarkable. And if you look at the data in terms of legislative work, you will find that women parliamentarians are doing far more work than their male counterparts, both in terms of work, the quality of laws they're bringing, their presence in the parliament and assemblies is so important.
Absolutely.
And then there is the Women Parliamentary Caucus. I want to give you the example of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, for example. The Women Parliamentary Caucus is a cross-party platform where women legislators come together. And in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, for example, they have been able to not only pass the law on domestic violence, but they have also negotiated budget allocations to make sure that that law is implemented. Now you had all the parties working together on ensuring the law gets implemented. So, in terms of the quality of work, in terms of the follow-up, in terms of also the issues that you see women raising.
Absolutely.
So here, is very remarkable. And remember that all these successes are after overcoming enormous challenges, because women do not have a level playing field. Politics in Pakistan is extremely male dominated. It is often quite violent, which also is inhibiting for women to enter the political process. But you see women overcoming these challenges and then performing so brilliantly. So I think we must celebrate all the women who make it to Parliament and who do such wonderful work.
Absolutely. Are also then sort of able to work past party demarcations and party lines to come together for the greater good and effect these wonderful policies and to be sort of united, because at the end of the day, that's the larger picture that all of us need to be looking at. But we're going to take a very quick break, a little celebratory pat on the back break, and we'll be back in just 1 minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to this really uplifting and surprisingly nice conversation about women's political empowerment and participation in Pakistan. And we are in conversation with Nighat Siddique, who is an additional Director General heading Gender, the Gender Wing at the Election Commission of Pakistan, and Ms. Rashda Dohad, who is the Executive Director of the Umar Asghar Khan Foundation. Now, Nighat, I know that you've also been a gender advisor to the Chairman of the National Disaster Management Authority, and I know that Rashda also has a specialization and a great interest in disaster management. So in sort of veering slightly away from policy and lawmaking here, I am interested in how women Well, I think that it is quite clear that when we're looking at disaster management and we're looking at women's vulnerability in it, it is immense. And I think that is also where we kind of come back full circle to policy or to strategies that will enable women to be safe during these kind of situations. And again, a lot of disaster management, it comes from places that we can't really anticipate, but what we can do is at least have systems in place that will be effective and that will work. So what's the kind of gender-sensitive approach to issues like this?
When I was working with the National Disaster Management Authority, I was also heading the Gender and Child Cell, and we came up with quite a few gender-sensitive policies for pre-disaster, during disaster, and post-disaster guidelines that they had. And we made gender-sensitive guidelines for reaching out to women, to elderly, to person with disability. And we also worked on child protection during disasters because, there are times that there are such situations that it creates a disaster within a disaster for children especially.
Yes.
So there were special guidelines that we made for child protection. We made them for women, especially women, not only with disability, women who were in a family way. Because a trauma could, play havoc with their health and with the child. So we came up with a very gender-sensitive approach and policy, where we would prepare the people who would be going out helping people, give them gender-sensitive trainings, come up with gender-sensitive kits for these the effecties of disaster. So I think a lot was done there. We have now gender-sensitive guidelines for all these cycles.
Yeah,
pre,
and I think,
during, and post.
Absolutely. And I think that it's really important to consider the fact that we do need gender-sensitive policy across the board because the world is not the same for men, women, children, and other vulnerable groups in society. And that's why gender policy is important, because I know that oftentimes there is that sort of argument that then, a policy is a policy. Why should it be different for one group and different for another? But that's clearly that because realities are very, apparent, and that you can't apply one policy, cannot be a one-size-fits-all for everybody. There needs to be allowances made for that. So Rashta, tell me a little bit more about what other areas do you think would benefit from policies that are more gender sensitive?
Let's look at disaster response, for example. In every disaster, and unfortunately, Pakistan has experienced a string of disasters from the 2005 earthquake, 2010 the floods, and now COVID. And in between, of course, we also had a lot of displacement that went on when we had different, military actions, etc., going on.
Absolutely.
So in every disaster, I think when you put in a lens, when you look at the vulnerabilities of different segments of people affected, you will find that some are affected more than others.
Yes.
So when we look at women, for example, and let me give you an example of the earthquake, because the earthquake, homes were lost, houses were destroyed, and so say in a village, if a man had to go, have cut his hair or even use a toilet or something, can do that, but a woman couldn't. So women's privacy was affected more. And some of the responses many organizations did, including ourselves, was to create women-friendly spaces so that they get, they reclaim a space where not only they can call their own, they would have toilet facilities, they could gather, and also, have a sense of solidarity so that they can share their grief that they were experiencing. Similarly, right now we had COVID, still do, and a lot of relief work was done at that time.
Huh.
So, say a gender-sensitive approach would be that you include things like sanitary napkins in the relief package, because when you had lockdowns, nobody could go out to get anything.
Yes,
So often, if
absolutely.
you don't have that sort of a perspective, you would think of, okay, let me give food, let me give, that sort of thing, which is, of course, very important.
Yes, of course.
But when you look at it from women's interests, you would add in the sanitary napkins also, because, women need that. And in lockdowns or, where mobility was restricted, there was no access to these essential items.
Absolutely. And then it really just boils down to a health issue that needs to be, you have to keep those things in mind. You can't just sort of erase 49.5% of Pakistan's population when we're looking at policies. So Nigar, tell me a little bit about how, what role does gender sensitivity play in administrative reform as well? And where are areas where, change is happening and the old ways are being, adjusted for these women who are making these inroads into policy and lawmaking?
To what Rashta just said,
Yes, please.
that for gender sensitive guidelines during distribution of food and health, and medicines, and for other basics.
Yes.
We used to have distribution points, and before putting in this gender sensitive guideline, they hardly catered for women's distribution points. If they were 20 feet or 30 feet away from the camps.
Yes.
And for a woman to pick up a 20 kgs bag of flour and reaching back to the camp would be very difficult. Whereas a man could do it conveniently.
Yes,
now
absolutely.
all those houses which were women-headed households, for them bringing food items or reaching out for medicines, because there would be a long line of men standing there, reaching out for toilets. All these things were very difficult. So after gender-sensitive guidelines in place, the distribution points were separately provided for women, and then that too close to their camps. Then
absolutely.
Special initiatives were taken.
And especially when you think about the fact that culturally women have always been in charge of feeding their families and looking after them. So we're looking at food and medicine.
Exactly.
And those are the two things that you need to facilitate for women, and especially women who are living in camps, in tents, who've lost everything.
Exactly. Now, during the rehab period, we tried to ensure that we had temporary schools in place. We had some sort of skill set arranged for women, so that they could earn something while they were not at the home because of floods and all. So small little things did add value to their life, did make their life a little more comfortable or easier at least.
Yes, and also sort of giving them, and that's the empowerment that we're talking about, is giving women a sense of strength and independence, that they are able to make a change in their own lives, even if it's a small one, but everything counts.
Talking about the change in the administration and how things are improving, I would say that looking at our parliament, you see a big number of women at very strategic positions. Like we have Deputy Speaker KBK, we have a Deputy Speaker, we had a Deputy Speaker in Sindh, we have a Deputy Speaker in Balochistan. Quite a few of our women have been speakers around. One of them, if you would remember, was the Speaker of National Assembly also.
Yes.
So we have women, we've had women at strategically placed, and they have played their role.
Absolutely. We have women like you and Rashda also who are paving the way, who are taking the fight forward. We have had a woman prime minister, and not many countries can say that. And thank you so much, Nighat and Rashda, for joining me today for this wonderful conversation. I know that, Pakistan doesn't do well on gender parity across the world. Our rankings are low. Representation is okay, but I think that we are small, but we are fierce, and we are working really hard. And kudos to all of you wonderful women out there who fight every single day to make this country better for all of us. Thank you so much. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time on the coffee table. Bye.